Dan has served as a lobbyist in New York and North Carolina for over 30 years, working to advance shared parenting legislation and bring attention to male victims of domestic violence. Today, Dan Romand continues to engage audiences and raise awareness of the issues men and boys face as the host of the Boy Meets Squirrel show every Wednesday and the Men Need to Be Heard podcast. So I'll hand it over to Dan.
Thank you, Father X. So, good afternoon and welcome, everybody. I have to say, it's a true honor for me to be here today. And I want to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity and also just take a moment to personally thank each and every one of you for being part of the conference. Your time's valuable. The fact that you chose to be a part of this event says a lot about the kind of men you are. Men who care, men who want to understand more, men who want to roll up their sleeves and make a difference. Now, as we begin with this, I want to start by asking you to think about this phrase: perception leads to reality. It's something we've all heard before. And for men and boys, it is, in my opinion, the biggest issue that we face. And we face it not just as men, but as a society. Now, why do I say that? Why is it so important for us to address this? Because when you hear something enough times, you start to believe it. If you're told over and over again that something or someone is the problem, or even that you yourself are the problem, inevitably it's going to start to creep in. And it really doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is that over time, what is being said starts to take hold and eventually becomes the truth. Or to put it more succinctly, perception becomes reality. And it's why I want you to keep that phrase in mind, not just as I'm speaking, but as all the other amazing presenters who will be following me are as well. And the reason it's so crucial is because we change perception, especially with regard to how men and boys are viewed, not to mention how we as advocates for them are seen. All of the important issues that we'll be covering today aren't going to be taken seriously. Until we start changing perception, we're not even going to be acknowledged and we're not going to be heard. In fact, it's why I named my YouTube channel Men Need to Be Heard, because in advocacy and doing work towards men's issues for 30 years, most of what we've had to say has fallen on deaf ears. It's really why I work so hard to raise awareness on all the issues that are going to be discussed today, because until we do, until we're heard, we're not going to be able to get to the next level, which is to get them addressed. And that's why, in my opinion, the most important thing that we need to do is change how we're perceived. It is, to borrow from my favorite book, The One Ring to Rule Them All. Now, let's face it, for the last 50 years, society has been fed a steady diet of negativity when it comes to men. And it didn't happen overnight. It also didn't happen by accident. It started pretty subtly. There were some jokes at our expense, some harmless sitcom gags, that type of thing. But over time, the narrative changed. And what may have been done for fun or a quick joke turned into something very different. And I argue it's led us to where we are today, where the media doesn't just make fun of men, it diminishes us and it demeans us. It tells us that we're incompetent, that we're villains, that we're irrelevant, and ultimately, I argue that we're disposable. And the worst part is, not only does now most of society wholeheartedly believe that, I argue that many of us have started to believe it as well. Now, I want you to go with me a trip back in time. I grew up in the early 70s, and every Friday night as a young boy, I tuned into my favorite show, The Brady Bunch. Hello, Marsha, Marsha, Marsha. My first true love. And none of you better go near her. She's mine. All right. And while that show was a comedy, a sitcom, and also considered somewhat groundbreaking at the time in that it actually showed a blended family, something that really wasn't seen on TV prior, it also had a much darker side, something that I started picking up even though I was 8, 9, 10 years old at the time. Now, let me first say that, grant, in many ways, it showed men in a positive manner. Heck, even today, Mike Brady, the dad, is considered a paragon of fatherhood in many circles. But for all the good that it showed, it also introduced something, let's just call it not so good. Something so subtle yet so And if you ever watch the show, and if you haven't, I encourage you to, each and every week there was a story. And in many of the stories, the three boys were often the butt of a joke. They were shown as clueless, lazy, or frankly, just plain dumb. The girls, for the most part, on the other hand, were shown as bright, responsible, and successful. And it was all by design, designed to encourage women to be all that they can be, while at the same time teaching boys that they were losers, incompetent, and worse. And you think back to that show, you often saw competitions between the boys and girls. And in almost every single case, it resulted in the girls coming out on top and the boys having had to learn some lesson. Now, look, at the time, maybe no one really thought much of it. After all, it was just a sitcom on Friday nights. But it set the stage for what was to come. Fast forward a decade or so, and it became clear this was not going to be just an isolated example. For example, over the years, we saw the emergence of a new archetype, the bumbling father. Starting off with Homer Simpson in the 80s, who became ultimately the face of fatherhood, I argue. Lazy, clueless, barely functioning, unable to take care of himself, let alone the kids. Fast forward to the 90s, we then had Ray Barone in Everybody Loves Raymond, who, while a great show, the man was portrayed as someone who couldn't make a decision to save his life. He had to constantly be corrected by his wife and mother. Go forward another decade, and then you had Phil Dunphy in Family, who was a lovable goof to be sure, but basically a man-child who needed his wife to be the adult for him. And then on top of that, of course, there's all the countless commercials we've all seen day after day that portrayed men and fathers as utterly clueless, incapable dolts who can't even do the most basic of tasks, such as making dinner or, God forbid, taking care of the kids. In the world of advertising, over time, men, especially dads, became punchlines. And I want you to think about that for a moment. How many times have you seen a commercial where the dad can't cook a meal without burning the house down, or the husband is completely lost, staring hopelessly into space until his wife swoops in to help him? This isn't just occasional, it's constant, day after day, week after week, year after year. And the message being sent is very clear. Men are incapable, men need to be corrected, men are basically overgrown children who need to be taken care of. And I want you to reflect on that for a moment and then ask yourself this. How does this affect us as men, and how does it affect the various issues we're going to be discussing today? Because let me tell you, gentlemen, it affects each and every one of them. Think about a family court judge sitting on a bench, about to make a decision on who's going to be given custody of the children, who's going to take care of them. And that judge has seen dads portrayed as bumbling idiots for pretty much their entire lives. I ask you, do we really want to believe that that negative stereotype of men and fathers in the media hasn't played a large factor in why women are awarded primary custody 85 to 90% of the time? How about the judges looking at allegations of abuse or requests for restraining orders, or a judge about to sentence a man who's been found guilty of a crime? Those judges have seen men portrayed as aggressive, abusive, and just plain downright dangerous time and again in movies and on TV. And again, I ask you, do you really believe that a judge who's been conditioned to believe that men, all men, are a risk, isn't going to have that affect their decision either consciously or subconsciously? There's a reason why men get harsher sentences. There's a reason why restraining orders are handed out like Pez candy. But it doesn't just stop there. Here we are in 2025, and we're on the third, fourth, some would say fifth generation of boys growing up watching this stuff, having it pounded into their heads, literally from birth, that they're inherently bad simply because they happen to be born male. That they're destined to grow up to either be a villain, a fool, or outright invisible. These boys are and have grown up with the thought that not only don't they matter, but that they are the problem for all of society. And again, I ask you, let that sink in for a moment, and then ask yourself these questions. Is it any wonder why so many young men are killing themselves? Is it any wonder why it's primarily young men who are shooting up schools? When you teach entire generations that there is something inherently wrong with them, that they are evil, not based on anything they've done, but simply because they were born male, and that they serve no purpose and that the world would be better off if they didn't exist, how can we be surprised that these boys are growing up so calloused, so incapable of empathy or caring, so devoid of a sense of right or wrong? And this is only exacerbated by the reality that many boys are growing up without any real male presence in their life. There's no one to teach them what it means to be a man and how to conduct themselves. There's no one teaching them the basics of what it means to be a man. What they end up doing then is learning what it means to be a man from the media. Media that, as we've talked about, portrays them in the way it does and has for decades. That's why this mindset is so pervasive and runs so deep that, as I said earlier, it has largely insinuated itself into all of the issues we're going to be discussing today. The fact of the matter is, this isn't just about bad TV or unfair commercials. It isn't even about stereotypes or agenda. Some ways it may not even be about what's right or wrong. In the end, what it's really about is survival. Our survival as human beings. Our survival as a society. The media's war on men and boys has real, devastating consequences for men and boys. And as I said, society as a whole. We're seeing it. Men are checking out in ever increasing numbers, checking out from the workforce, checking out from education, checking out from relationships, and yes, checking out from society as a whole. They're even checking out from life itself, as evidenced by the staggering high suicide rates for men and boys. Perception is reality. And the reality of today is that men and boys are viewed as unwanted, unneeded, and unnecessary. And when you tell someone that they are worthless long enough, as has been done to men for decades, my friends, they start to believe it. And again, we're seeing the results of that all around us. We're seeing it play out in all the other issues that we're going to be talking about today. Sadly, perception has become reality, and it's not who we are, not as men and not as human beings. We're not the weak, incompetent, beastly fools that the media portrays us to be. We're builders, we're leaders, we're protectors. We are necessary. Our grandfathers stormed the beaches of Normandy. Our forefathers built the world we live in today. I argue that everything we take for granted in today's society, from the food we eat to the water we drink, to the roads we travel and the electricity that powers our home, all of it was built and is maintained by men. Yet society, rather than appreciate or acknowledge any of that, tells men, you are no longer needed. You are the problem. And as we go along with that, I want you to think about what's the next step. For me, the answer is for us to say, enough is enough. It's time we take a stand and unite as one. We have to work together and address all of the issues that we're discussing today in order to help change the perception and change reality. So how do we do that? Well, it starts right here and right now. It starts by educating ourselves on the issues and then working together to figure out the best way to address them. And most importantly, it starts by holding the media accountable, calling out their bigotry and negative portrayals of men. It starts by making it clear to everyone around us that the way men and boys are portrayed matters, how it affects how society sees us and how we see ourselves. And to that end, that's why we need to come together and stand as one. We need to support one another. I often tell men, if you're a father, be an active, strong role model for your sons. Show them what real masculinity looks like. If you see a young boy being raised without a male figure in his life, step up and be that figure. If you see a brother struggling, reach out and let him know you're there. Finally, what is most important, if we want to change the narrative, we've got to challenge it. We need to stop sitting on the sidelines. The media isn't going to change unless we make it change. And we do that by sharing our stories, talking about our experiences, by not allowing them to silence us. We do that by creating our own platforms that show men and boys positively. We do that by standing up and saying, no more. No more are we going to allow you, the world, to define us as weak and useless. Because we are neither. We are men. We matter. In closing, let me go back to where I began, where I said perception leads to reality. And for 50 years, the media has crafted a false perception of men. And today we've seen the results. We're seeing our issues being ignored and our rights trampled on. We see men retreating, disengaging, and outright disappearing. And we're seeing the current results, but they're not the end ones unless we let them be. That's why I say, gentlemen, we have the power to change the perception and change the reality. We have the power, if we come together, to let everyone know we do matter, that we are valuable and we are strong. We all know the world's a better place when men step up. Not because we're told to or because we've been shamed into it, but because it's who we are. I want you to always keep in your mind, what is the public perception on the topic and how can I make changes to it? It's our time, gentlemen. It's time we take back the narrative and show the world what real men look like. The thing that I would say we need to focus on more than anything else right now is social media, because the mainstream media is just not going to buy into it right now. But if we can get more into the social media realm, whether it's supporting one another's channels, whether it's pushing to get one of us on some of the bigger podcasts. The dream would be obviously Joe Rogan, but there's plenty of others out there that are actually sympathetic to us. They don't always come to us, though. They get what I call non-experts in to talk about the issues. If we can come together and make pushes for that, and the way you do that is building up various creators. I always encourage people to follow Father X's channel, that type of thing. The more subscribers you have, the more people you have, the more likely, one, you're going to be able to get guests, two, that more likely they're going to pay attention to you. And media comes down to two things, and that's it: eyeballs and ears. That's all they care about. They don't care about the truth. They don't care about anything more than how many people can I get to watch or listen so that I can then sell advertising and charge the rates I want to charge based on that. That's ultimately what it comes down to. And that's where our biggest fight is to make sure that they see us as potential eyeballs and ears.